Long before Al Capone turned his eye to bootlegging, and well before Bugsy Siegl decided to take his ill-gotten gains and cash in on the casino boom in Vegas, there was another boss in town. This one was perhaps the most unassuming of ladies, and within just a few years of setting foot on American soil for the first time, she had built up one of the largest organized crime empires that the still new nation had ever seen. When the papers talked about her, and they talked about her a lot, they called her Mother Mandelbaum. Why? Well, as she once said herself, "I am Ma because I give them what a mother cannot sometimes give: money and horses and diamonds." And she took care of her children, a vast network of criminals from all walks of life and with all kinds of specialities. She guided them, trained them, and when it was necessary, she protected them as only a mother could. Her story starts in the middle of the 19th century, when people were coming from all across Europe to find a new life in the land of opportunity and promise. Some were looking for a fresh start, some were trying to escape the dire conditions of their homelands, and others were just looking for adventure. What they found when they got to America was often a bit of a far cry from what they had imagined. Fredericka Mandelbaum and her husband Wolf Israel were just two of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who poured into New York City in the mid-1800s. Sources vary as to the exact date, but suggest that they left Europe around 1848 and settled in an area of New York City's Lower East Side known as Little Germany. It wasn't a great place, but it was a place where like-minded and undoubtedly adventurous individuals could find others who shared a history, a culture, and struggles. And there were a lot of struggles. The typical tenement apartment was a mere 325 feet, and most were home to as many as 15 people. Life in America, it wasn't as much about living as it was about survival, and in order to survive, Mandelbaum and her husband spent their days, up to 14 hours at a time, as street peddlers. This wasn't an entirely new way of life for them. You see, Mandelbaum was from one of the handful of Jewish families living in the German state of Hesse-Kassel, and they weren't just a minority, they existed on the outskirts of more mainstream society. Jewish families like hers were often assaulted and extorted, forced to remain on the move for their own safety, especially if they didn't pay the protection money that thugs often demanded in exchange for simply leaving them alone. It's likely her father made a living as a merchant and a peddler, buying and selling second-hand goods to support his family, but this is only speculation. For the early years of their marriage, she and her husband lived the lives of wandering peddlers as well. This was a hard life, and one where they could expect to earn only about $6 a week. In August 1857, a massive hurricane sunk a ship called the Central America. It had been carrying a huge amount of gold, and without that gold, the economy also started to sink. It was a huge deal and caused a major financial panic as businesses large and small started to fail, investments crashed, and people realized they were suddenly facing unemployment and ruin. But something else happened too. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and with more and more people facing empty kitchens and even emptier bellies, crime rose a lot. A surge of children took to the streets, often sent there by destitute parents desperate to find something to feed their families. Little hands, they were perfect for picking pockets and stealing whatever wasn't nailed down, and even in the face of economic ruin, there were lots of opportunities for most enterprising young scavengers. Children took to the dirty, littered streets of the city to find anything that might help them make life a little more bearable. A bit of cotton that fell from a bale, flour and sugar carelessly spilled onto the street, and general junk that was just lying around the place. Sometimes these things, they were dropped and discarded. Sometimes they were stolen. And all of those thieves, they needed a place to sell their stolen goods. I mean, you can't eat jewelry after all. And Mother Mandelbaum, she saw a brilliant business opportunity. Forging ahead without any real help from her husband, who police would later note was a non-entity, Mandelbaum started buying and selling what those scavengers found, and she also started buying from the female pickpockets and thieves that made their living nicking stuff from some of the high-end department stores that still catered to the city's wealthy. Mother Mandelbaum had a few things going for her, and one of those things was her experience not just buying and selling, but haggling on prices. When she bought, she offered about a fifth of what she thought she could sell the item for, and given that peddlers averaged only a few dollars a week at the time selling the standard sort of fare, the markup that came with branching out into stolen goods gave her a serious boost in income. And she made the most of it. 8 years after the crash, Mandelbaum had built up the cash and connections to be able to lease a building that contained a dry goods store. Rent was steep, and adjusted for inflation, she paid an estimated $6,100 and $6,500 for her first and second year there. That's certainly a lot more than a peddler's salary would have realistically supported, so clearly there was something fishy going on. But this was 19th century New York, and looking the other way was sort of a way of life. The store was indeed just a front for her operation, and it wasn't long before she was dealing in everything from jewels, particularly diamonds, to fine silk and lace, silver, gold, and even horses and carriages. Once she even bought and resold an entire herd of goats because, well, if it made money, she was in. She was excellent at hiding what she was doing as well, employing other German immigrants and listing them as salespeople on her census records, and technically that was kinda true. It wasn't just merchandise lifted off the streets of New York that found its way into her warehouses either. When the Great Chicago Fire swept through the city in 1871, there was, unsurprisingly, a ton of looting and pillaging going on there. A lot of what was stolen ended up passing through her hands and her warehouses, and it was all adding to her bottom line. If Mother Mandelbaum had simply been a fence, just someone who only bought and sold stolen goods for a considerable profit, the story might have ended there. But she wasn't just buying and selling stolen goods. She built up a massive network of connections that stretched across the country and well up into Canada. Even as she took more and more little pickpockets under her wing, she would also turn around and greet cops and judges, particularly the ones that had a loose interpretation of the law, with a friendly smile. Even local politicians knew how popular she was, and they were sure to keep on her good side. There was some serious bribery going on there, as you might expect, and let's be completely honest, at the time New York City was filled with just as much corruption as it was cockroaches. It was a time when the city was under the watchful eye of the notoriously crooked politicians of Tammany Hall, the entity behind the 1850s city council nicknamed the 40 Thieves. By the time Mother Mandelbaum's operation was in full swing, Boss Tweed was in charge. Given that he was known for working in an office that he opened solely to have an official place to take payments, it's safe to say he was fine with all kinds of unlawful shenanigans. Tammany Hall, in particular, was well aware of her operation and made it a point to keep on Mother Mandelbaum's good side. She couldn't vote, that's true, but she was rapidly becoming very influential, and she knew plenty of people who could vote. One hand washes the other, and Mandelbaum's empire continued to grow while Tweed was, quite literally, given the keys to the city's treasury in 1870 and started expanding his own criminal enterprises. Tweed is a politician that history remembers as being one of the most corrupt politicians to ever rise to power in the city. A New York state senator with a list of other titles and positions a mile long, Tweed used his political clout to swindle and steal an unthinkable amount of money from the city's coffers, a haul which would, in today's money, amount to around $3.5 billion in ill-gotten gains. His Tammany Hall was a powerful ally for Mother Mandelbaum to have. Meanwhile, Mandelbaum started hiring more than just a few hungry street urchins. There was only so far they were going to be able to take her after all, and acquiring the loot was only half the job. She had to get rid of it too, and so she started building a team of associates to launder her merchandise. Engravers who could remove identifying marks from jewelry were taken into her confidence. Cab drivers were kept on call in case someone needed to make a fast escape, and partners at a major law firm, Howe and Hummel, were kept on retainer just in case. She even had a special fund for her most trusted associates and called it perhaps the most honest name she could have used: the Bureau for the Protection of Criminals. The face of the city was changing, and Mother Mandelbaum was there to take advantage of it every step of the way. Sure, Mother Mandelbaum increased her wealth exponentially when she branched out into selling stolen goods, but she didn't stop there. She was an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs are always looking for the next big thing. For her, it was bankrolling other criminal enterprises undertaken by some of the most audacious criminals in her little black book of names. You got to spend money to make money, the old saying goes, and that's even true of crime. The countless immigrants who moved to the young New York City helped build it on the shoulders of talents brought from the old world, and German immigrants, they excelled at engraving. From woodcuts and prints, it was just a short hop, skip, and a jump into counterfeiting, and that was just one aspect of her organization. Even as her own finances continued to climb, she made it clear that if someone had a great plan and even better skills, she was willing to bankroll jobs that would turn a profit. She was connected to some of the biggest bank robbers at the time, including people like Wesley Allen and Michael Kurtz. She also had provided the startup funds for a job that would turn into one of the biggest robberies of them all. A known associate of George Leonidas Leslie, she provided him with around $65,000 in today's money to get the people and tools needed to rob the Manhattan Savings Bank in 1878. And rob it he did, netting $2,747,700 from the bank frequented by people with names like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie. To put that in perspective, we need to adjust for inflation. Today, that one score would be worth around $72 million, give or take. There was a certain sort of symbiosis to the whole setup. Without Mother Mandelbaum, the city's thieves and pickpockets would have nowhere to launder their stolen goods, and without her ring of thieves, Mandelbaum wouldn't have had a steady flow of goods to buy, mark up, and flip. It's no wonder she wanted to take care of them, and in order to make sure her thieves were the very best they could be, legend says she opened Mandelbaum's Grand Street School in 1870. It's an unassuming name, perhaps, but anyone who walked through the doors of the storefront on Clinton and Grand Street was walking into a school designed to give the city's street children some valuable life lessons, the sort that involved checking your morals at the door. And there were plenty of children who needed to learn if they were going to survive, as the city was teeming with orphan children who were known to the more fortunate as street rats. The school started with the basic, and kids were taught criminal life skills like pickpocketing and the art of misdirection. While there's no official transcripts from the school, which isn't exactly surprising, it's believed that Mandelbaum recruited some of the city's finest adult thieves and conmen to teach the children criminal skills. Those that showed an innate talent were taught other things: blackmail, the art of the con, burglary, and even safecracking. And Mandelbaum recruited the best of the best to come and to work for her directly, including one young woman who had become known as the Princess of Crime. Sophie Lance was one of Mandelbaum's star students, and after getting her start learning from her pickpocket parents, then being taken under mother's wing, Lance became notorious as a con artist and a thief who ran some seriously brazen scams. One of her favorites was reportedly using her feminine wiles to lure men into her hotel room, sweet-talk them out of their clothes, and then blackmail them. Lance eventually gave up her life of crime and condemned Mandelbaum for taking advantage of the lonely, hungry, and desperate, setting them on a path of crime they may never have gone down otherwise. That's certainly one way to look at it, but not everyone was quite so critical. In fact, most people had quite the opposite view of their matronly crime lord. As for the school, that was fairly short-lived. Mandelbaum shut it down herself in 1876 after only 6 years. So why shut down something so successful? Well, that's because she got wind of a new student who had enrolled, and she was too smart to let the son of a police officer in on her secrets. Mother Mandelbaum's massive crime empire spanned from the lowliest pickpockets to the upper echelons of New York City's political landscape. No one can be at work all the time, though, and when Mandelbaum wasn't dealing in stolen jewels or herds of goats, she was far from frightening. She didn't prowl the streets with a gun just looking for trouble. She didn't rule her neighborhood with an iron fist, and in fact, by all accounts, she was rather nice. When her obituary ran in the German-language paper, the New York Volkszeitung, it described her as honorable and reliable, and as someone whose word was as good as gold. When New York City's law enforcement was asked about her character, Police Chief George W. Wailing described her this way: "As a woman and a mother, she is spoken of with respect. Others spoke of her as a wonderful woman, a woman of ability and nerve, and lauded her for her generosity." It wasn't just her generosity people spoke highly of, though. It was also her parties. At the same time she was buying and selling and dealing, Mandelbaum was living in a house on the Lower East Side where she held soirees and sent out invitations from the Honorable and Mrs. William Mandelbaum. The parties were sometimes elegant, formal affairs, sometimes summertime picnics, but they were always exciting. The guest lists would include all of New York's most prominent judges and politicians, along with some of her criminal empire. It would allow business acquaintances to rub elbows, schmooze over cocktails, and ultimately further their own movement upwards through the hierarchy of crime. And that was fine with her. At any rate, aside from the whole criminal empire thing, Mother Mandelbaum was almost shockingly conventional. She was a generous and respected member of her synagogue. She invited her associates into her home to visit with her children, and when those in her organization needed help, she provided it. And that's likely one of the things that allowed her to stay in business for quite so long. When it came to dealing with those in her own community, she was known for offering jobs when they were needed and even undercutting the prices offered by legitimate wholesalers and giving struggling families the help they badly needed. When it came time for law enforcement to bring her down, they knew they were on their own. Her close-knit community, they would not betray her. So here's a question. Where's the police in all of this? Sure, bribery can get you somewhere, but it just takes one person not willing to take some cash and look the other way to bring it all tumbling down. New York City's police department was fairly new at the time, and they hadn't quite figured out what their role was in the growing city. When they were on the streets, they were looking for some specific things: gang-related brawls, drunken disorderly disruptions, and the vocal, troublesome crowds that tended to congregate when social reformers and the like got a little too preachy on their soapboxes. When it came to Mandelbaum, she was parked firmly in the blind spot of a police department who would only negotiate for the return of stolen goods if the victim paid them to do so. And this was an official policy, not just some corrupt cop doing some shady stuff to see what they could fill their pockets with. Since it was sometimes easier for victims just to forget about what they'd lost, thieves and fences dealing in stolen goods knew they weren't a high priority. Still, it's wildly impressive that Mother Mandelbaum managed to stay out of any real and serious trouble for around 30 years. Okay, so what was it that finally brought down her criminal empire? Well, it was a bolt of silk and the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It wasn't until 1884 that a New York district attorney named Peter Olson had finally had enough of the Queen of Fences and turned to the Pinkertons for help. They sent Detective Gustave Frank, who got an introduction through someone perhaps not as loyal as Mandelbaum had thought. When police finally raided her warehouse, they found silk that the undercover Pinkerton had sold her and a ton of other stolen merchandise. So now you might be wondering, well, what exactly is a ton? How much stolen loot was there? One contemporary journalist wrote, "It did not seem possible that so much wealth could be assembled in one spot. There seemed to be enough clothes to supply an army. There were trunks filled with precious gems and silverware. Antique furniture was stacked against a wall." And keep in mind that this is at a time when children were playing in the streets alongside the decomposing remains of carriage horses, which were just left where they had fallen, and when many parents weren't sure how they were going to feed their families. Most wouldn't have been able to envision holding a single earring, much less be able to imagine a whole suitcase of precious jewels. There should have been enough there to put her away for a long time, but remarkably, that didn't happen. Mandelbaum, her son, and her clerk insisted that they were simply running a dry goods store, which technically was almost true. She claimed she had never stolen anything, which again, well, you've kind of got to give that to her. In all her career, she really never did steal anything herself. Mandelbaum was let out on bail, which she promptly jumped and headed north into Canada. And the story is still not done. 10 years later, Mandelbaum had set herself up as a respectable sort of citizen living in Hamilton, Ontario, working in a hat shop and participating in the local Hebrew congregation. But is there any more to the story than that? Possibly. At any rate, by 1894, she had found herself pining for her old stomping grounds in the 13th Ward. She made that known too, telling friends and acquaintances just as much. Then in February of that year, Mandelbaum passed away. A coffin was headed from Ontario to New York City. But here's the thing. No one really knew if it was actually her body or just one more brilliant cog in the well-oiled machine that had allowed her to stay a free woman for so long. Did she fake her death so she could return to her beloved city in peace? People thought she might have. Was she now calling herself Madame Fuchs and returning to her roots as a simple peddler? It's entirely possible. No one ever really knew, just as no one knows how much money she handled in her lifetime. Estimates vary, with one suggesting that when she fled New York in 1884, she left behind merchandise that in today's money would be worth around $24 million, give or take. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. And don't forget to subscribe. We got multiple videos like this every single week. So when you subscribe, hit that bell icon. You will find out when we put out those new videos. So please do that. Also, why not check out some videos from the archive that are linked to on the screen. And as always, thank you for watching.